My fiancé's work comes first now, Brooke said, her voice cutting through the salt air. You can either serve him like staff or pack your bags and leave the lighthouse. I was holding a tray of mint tea, steam curling up into the cool afternoon breeze. The scent mingled with briny air and the faint sweetness of harbor wildflowers. 68 years old and my own niece thought I'd bow like a maid. I set the tray down, my fingers brushing the smooth pine table we'd sanded together years ago. She wouldn't meet my eyes. Chase stood beside her, the wind ruffling his designer hair, smiling for someone's phone camera. The gulls cried overhead sharp and restless. Somewhere a Bowie bell clanged, steady, indifferent to human pride. Inside my chest, something ancient shifted, like the lighthouse beam turning toward a storm. Folks, what would you do if family gave you an ultimatum like that? Would you fight back or walk away? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. The party had all the trimmings of summer perfection. White canvas tents, the clink of champagne glasses, lobster rolls served on porcelain, but beneath it a current pulled hard and cold. Rockport Bay glittered under a pale sun. The smell of grilled oysters floated past, masking the faint must of old rope from the dock. I could still feel the grit of sand on my heels from the walk over. Brooke leaned into Chase's arm, flashing her ring like a lighthouse flash. I remembered her as a girl, hair tangled with salt, begging to help me scrub floors after a storm. She used to say the lighthouse smelled like safety. Now she called it on-tap brand potential. I sipped my tea, lukewarm, a little bitter. Chase's voice carried, pitch just enough for nearby guests to hear. Your aunt's place is quaint, he told a man in a pale linen suit, but it needs to serve a bigger story than dusty books and bed and breakfast guests. Dusty books? Those shelves had weathered gales, rescued paper from salt and mold. Each spine I'd saved was a living thing to me. I smiled because my mother taught me you never let the first blow land without a mask. The mask buys time. Brooke stepped closer. There's no space for both your way and ours, Aunt Evelyn. Decide before summer ends. Her words were polished smooth, but they struck like stones. The tide lapped at the pilings, a rhythm older than any of us. My palms rested on the worn leather handle of my husband's old suitcase, the one with his initial H stitched in gold thread. I had brought it down from the attic that morning, without knowing why. I thought of all the hands that had turned the lighthouse key. Keepers before me. My husband's mine. Keys are funny things. You can use them to open doors or to keep them shut. Someone popped a champagne cork. Laughter burst across the tent. I let my gaze drift to the dock across the bay, quiet, weathered mine. Brooke was waiting for a crack, the collapse she'd seen in others when cornered. Instead, I nodded, slow as the turning tide. All right, I said. I'll go. Her smile was the kind people practice in mirrors. Chase clapped someone on the back. The harbor kept breathing in and out. I walked past the tables, past the silver trays and white roses, out toward the path. The suitcase felt lighter than it should, maybe because I wasn't carrying what they thought. The cottage on the far shore was small, drafty, and mine to rent year-round. From its porch, I could see the dock and the only wooden ramp sturdy enough for catering carts, camera rigs, or wedding arches. A ramp no one could use for commerce without my say, so. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of seaweed and something electric, possibility. The lighthouse stood across the water, pale against the horizon, its beam unlit in daylight. It would shine again, but not for them. By the time the gulls settled back onto the pilings, I had my next step in mind. Not revenge for its own sake, but something quieter. Something that would make the tide turn. And I knew exactly when the first wave would hit. Before the ultimatum, there were years the sea tried to take the lighthouse back. I learned its moods the hard way, one storm at a time. The first winter alone, salt crept under the door like a thief. I stuffed towels in the crack and boiled water for steam. I hoped to lift damp from spines already swollen. The windows rattled like tin cups. Books came to me wounded, pages furred with salt, bindings split. I brushed sand from margins, pressed paper flat under smooth stones. I set a fan to hum all night. Goodness, folks love to say a lighthouse keeps people safe. It keeps paper safe, too. I learned to wrap a rescued novel in muslin. I turned it every hour like bread in a low oven. Back then, Brooke was small and barefoot, hair crunchy with salt. She'd climb onto a stool with a rag and say, "Let me help." We read Charlotte's Web until the gulls fell quiet. She once fell asleep against the stacks, cheeks smudged with graphite. My husband, Henry Hart, believed in small towns and stubborn work. He came home smelling of rope tar and fresh coffee. He laid receipts on the table and circled numbers until they behaved. "Keep the dock in my name, Eve," he said once, tapping a file. "It's the spine." I didn't understand until the nor'easter of '09 smashed 2 ramps and bent a piling. The dock held. The lighthouse beam swung white on spindrift. My gloves froze on the rail, salt stung my lips. The tide hissed underfoot, cold and relentless. Braith smoked white. After Henry passed, silence nested in the stairwell like a winter bird. I kept climbing anyway. I changed bulbs, scraped rust, and learned which bolt begged for oil by the squeak it made. Some mornings, a foghorn moaned so low my ribs hummed. The inn grew room by room. I bartered nights for carpentry. I poured blueberry jam for painters. I taught fishermen's kids to mend pages in the reading room. The place smelled like butter, pine, and run-tide. Then came a letter on Thicktown stationery, crisp and important. I can still hear the blade whisper when it opened. The council renewed the dock lease exactly as Henry said it. Exclusive access to the ramp, and the only commercial-grade walkway in the cove. I filed it under H with his watch and a map curled at the edges. Summer tasted different after that, lupines blue-purple along the fence. I learned which vendors needed the ramp and which could roll up the lawn without breaking a wrist. People think legacy is marble names and clean plaques. Here, it's the smell of dried paper and kettles singing. It's a key warm in your palm because you used it before dawn, not because someone handed it to you shining. Brooke grew taller, busier, and then away. I kept the light steady anyway. The bay still glittered, and the dock still waited like a kept promise. The years at Harbor Light were stitched together with salt air and the steady pulse of the tide. I had rebuilt that lighthouse in the way some people patch a favorite quilt. Piece by piece, thread by thread, never minding the hours. It was my husband Harold's dream first, but after he was gone, it became my anchor. The walls held our laughter, the creak of his boots on the stairs, the quiet murmur of guests reading by the fire. Every season had its own scent. Winter brought the sharp tang of wood smoke curling from the chimney. Spring carried damp lilac from the bushes that clung stubbornly to the rocky hill. In summer, the kitchen filled with the lemony brightness of fresh-baked scones. Autumn, well, that was cinnamon and tide, a mix so comforting it could make even the loneliest traveler linger. I can still see Brooke at 10 years old, curled up in the big armchair by the front window, legs tucked under her, a book nearly as wide as her chest resting in her lap. She would watch the gulls between chapters, her eyes following their swoops and dives. Back then, she thought Harbor Light was a kind of magic. So did I. The regulars, fishermen, retired schoolteachers, a widower who painted seascapes, made the place feel like a second living room. They'd sit at my long oak table, tea steaming, trading stories like trading cards. I never charged for the extra scone that, accidentally, appeared on their plates. No one in town would let the lighthouse go dark. It was more than a building. It was a part of us. And in those days, Brooke's visits were never about business plans or optimization charts. She'd come to help me string up twinkle lights before the first snow, or to test a new tea blend, her laughter bouncing off the stone walls. I didn't realize then how rare that warmth was. You never do until it cools. The Harbor Light years taught me more than any library ever could. How to keep a kettle just shy of boiling for the perfect steep. How to read the clouds over the bay and know if you had 2 hours or 20 minutes before a storm. How to listen so deeply that people said things they hadn't meant to share, then thanked you for hearing them. Sometimes, late at night, I'd sit on the back steps with a blanket racked tight, listening to the low hum of the beacon sweeping over the water. Each flash felt like Harold winking from some far shore, telling me I was doing just fine. I believed him. Those memories are why Brooke's words at the engagement party hit me like a cold wave. She wasn't just talking about a building, she was talking about hollowing out the heart of everything I'd tended for decades. And that, I knew I could never let happen. It happened 2 weeks after the engagement party. The Lighthouse had just hosted its last booked weekend before Brooke and Chase's creative team were set to arrive. I was in the kitchen, wiping down the counter, when I heard their voices drift in from the parlor. "Like a cute backdrop, but not really functional," Chase was saying. His tone was easy, the kind people use when they think you can't hear, or won't matter if you do. Brooke laughed, soft but sharp. "She means well, but she's set in her ways. We'll have to clear out all the old clutter if we want good shots." Clutter. That's what she called the books, the tea tins, the photographs in driftwood frames. My hand stilled on the rag. The lemon-scented cleaner caught in my throat. I stepped into the doorway just as Chase gestured toward the shelves in the reading room. All this. It's quaint. But it makes the place feel like a grandma's attic. Brooke noticed me then. She smiled the way you smile at a guest you didn't expect to see. Oh, Aunt Evelyn. Chase was just talking about refreshing the space. Is that so? I said, keeping my voice as calm as the tide before a storm. From the window, gulls wheeled in the gray sky. The wind carried the tang of seaweed through the slightly open pane. My pulse kept time with the creak of the old floorboards under my feet. They moved on, talking about lighting angles and content flow. I busied myself stacking saucers, each porcelain clink a metronome for my thoughts. I had learned long ago that you don't always answer insults. Sometimes you just note where they land. Later that afternoon, I walked into town to pick up honey from Lydia. The main street smelled of salt and fried clams, shop doors propped open to coax in the last of the summer visitors. I told her, in fewer words than I could have used, about the conversation. She handed me the jar, golden in the light. You don't have to fight them on their field, she said. The dock's yours. Remember that? I did remember. And yet, the sting of Grandma's attic followed me home. It was more than a jab at taste, it was a warning. They didn't just want to change the lighthouse. They wanted to erase its fingerprints. That evening, I made myself a pot of peppermint tea and sat in the reading room, lights low. My eyes wandered over the spines I'd rescued from damp boxes and estate sales. A well-thumbed Thoreau. A sea-weathered Melville. Stories that had survived worse than careless words. The tide shifted outside, sending a hollow knock through the pilings. Somewhere in the dark, the dock creaked like it was listening. I sipped slow. Let them think they'd scored a point. Let them believe they could strip away what made this place breathe. The beam in the tower swept across the bay, steady and silent, reminding me that not all power needs to announce itself. Not yet. The next blow came sooner than I expected. It was a Saturday, and the town's historical society had arranged a walking tour of Rockport's landmarks. The lighthouse was the final stop. I'd opened the parlor, brewed a big pot of cinnamon tea, and laid out shortbread on a silver tray Harold had found at a flea market 30 years ago. The first guests had barely crossed the threshold when Brooke appeared, all smiles and clipboards. Chase trailed behind her, carrying a ring light under one arm. Don't mind us? She chirped to the tour group. We're just setting up for some content. The guide, a tall man with a voice like gravel, was halfway through explaining the lighthouse's Civil War-era construction when Chase cut in. We'll definitely be updating this interior. It's charming, but you can tell it hasn't been professionally styled in decades. A ripple of polite laughter ran through the group. My cheeks burned hot. I stood by the tea table, one hand resting on the handle of the pot. The scent of cinnamon curled upward, steadying me. Brooke picked up a stack of mismatched saucers. These are sweet, but for the shoots we'll probably go with something cleaner. White porcelain photographs so much better. They photograph history better too, I said, my voice light. A few guests glanced my way, unsure whether I was joking. The guide cleared his throat and pressed on. As I was saying, the original keepers willed. Probably never imagine it looking like this. Chase interrupted, sweeping an arm toward the shelves. So much visual noise. Visual noise. That was a new one. I noticed one woman in the group frown. Her gaze lingering on the row of weathered novels behind him. I poured tea into delicate cups, each one a small act of defiance. Saucer, cup, pour, steady as a tide. The guests accepted them, and more than one murmured a thank you. The cinnamon scent wrapped around us like a shield. When the group moved upstairs, I lingered behind to refill the pot. Brooke stayed too, her voice dropping low. Aunt Evelyn, it's not personal. We just have to make it work for the brand. The brand. Not the history, not the heart, just the brand. I'm sure you'll do what you think is best, I said, keeping my tone as neutral as the sea on a still day. As their footsteps faded up the stairwell, I looked around the parlor. The late afternoon light pooled on the floorboards, warm and golden, touching the books, the teacups, the old photographs. Visual noise, Chase had called it. To me it was the hum of a place alive. Outside, the dock waited in the lengthening shadows. A gull wheeled low, its cry carrying across the water. My hand tightened on the teapot handle. Every word they'd said was fuel now, banked like coals. They thought they were clearing space for their vision. What they didn't know was that mine was already set, and the tide was starting to turn. The papers came in a white envelope with a gold foil return address. It was late afternoon, the bay calm enough to reflect the gulls like ghosts on the water. I'd just finished sweeping sand from the back steps when Brooke's SUV rolled into the gravel drive. She stepped out in a linen blazer far too crisp for the weather, clutching the envelope like it might burn her fingers. "Aunt Evelyn?" she called, her voice pitch bright. "Got a little formality for you." She followed me into the kitchen without waiting for an invitation. The scent of rosemary bread cooling on the counter filled the air, but it didn't soften the set of her jaw. "These are just updates," she said, sliding the envelope across the pine table. "Standard stuff before we start renovations and filming. Chase's lawyer recommended it. I eased the papers free." The first page was a tangle of legalese, but the bold heading caught my eye. "Operational transfer agreement?" My thumb traced the heavy type. It wasn't an update. It was a handover. "Looks like you've left the dock lease out," I said, keeping my tone mild. "Oh, we'll fold that in once we've streamlined the assets," she replied, eyes flicking to the bread instead of me. "Streamlined." I read on, scanning for the quiet traps. Page 3 gave them exclusive operational oversight of the lighthouse, including all auxiliary properties essential to commercial function. The dock, the ramp, everything Henry had told me to keep. I set the papers down and reached for the kettle, letting silence stretch between us. Steam rose in soft white curls. "And what do I get in return?" "Partnership credit, of course," Brooke said quickly. "We'd list you as founder emeritus on the brand site. You'd still live here, just not have to worry about the day. Today, founder emeritus. A title without teeth." I poured 2 mugs of tea. The peppermint scent wrapped around us, familiar and sharp. "Sounds generous." She smiled, relieved, mistaking my calm for agreement. "I knew you'd see the value." We drank in near silence, the only sound the tick of the wall clock. Outside, a lobster boat's engine coughed to life, low and steady. When she left, papers still on the table, I read them again. Every clause was a tide pulling me away from the shore. Every definition tucked in a corner was a loophole to slide the dock under their name. I thought of Harold's handwriting on the lease renewal. The ink faded but sure. I thought of the storm that had nearly taken the ramp, and the way we'd stood in the rain to make sure it held. That piece of wood and steel was more than an asset. It was the spine of the place. I folded the agreement neatly, slipped it back into the envelope, and placed it in the desk drawer under the lamp. The brass knob felt cool against my palm. Some people fight with shouts and slammed doors. I'd learned to fight by holding still, letting the other side believe they were winning until they stepped too far. The sun dipped lower, painting the bay in gold and rose. The lighthouse's shadow stretched long over the water, touching the dock first, as it always had. And in that lengthening shade, I knew this was the first move of a longer game. On Monday morning, I walked into town with the envelope tucked inside my canvas market bag. The air was brisk enough to pinch my cheeks, and the harbor smelled of diesel and kelp. Seagulls loitered on the lampposts like they were waiting for the day's gossip. The records office was tucked behind the post office, a squat brick building with windows clouded from years of salt spray. Inside, the air smelled faintly of old paper and lemon cleaner. Margaret, who'd been clerk since Harold was a boy, looked up from her desk. "Morning, Evelyn," she said, eyeing the envelope. "That looks official." "Just making sure my paperwork's in order," I said. My voice stayed casual, but my fingers tightened on the strap of my bag. She led me to the back counter where the property ledgers were kept. The dock lease was exactly where I'd last seen it. Thick cream paper, embossed seal, Harold's signature bold under mine. I traced the date, renewed 5 years ago, good for another 15. Transferable only with my written consent. Margaret tapped the clause with a fingernail. "Still ironclad," she said. "Anyone trying to work around it is in for a headache." I slid the copy into a protective sleeve and tucked it into my bag. That paper was more than proof. It was a lifeline. On my way out, I stopped at Lydia's shop for a jar of honey. The place smelled of beeswax and sweet clover. She poured tea into 2 mismatched mugs and leaned on the counter. "Heard Chase's credit line got clipped last month," she said. "Restaurant folks talk." I raised an eyebrow. "Oh." Investors pulled out of his expansion. "Too much flash, not enough cash. He's looking for a big anchor to steady things." She gave me a pointed look. "Your lighthouse would be a shiny anchor." I sipped my tea, letting the warmth seep into my hands. The picture was getting clearer. This wasn't just about a brand makeover. It was about propping up something already sinking. Back at the lighthouse, the tide was halfway out, exposing the dark, seaweed-slick stones under the dock. I stood at the end of the ramp, listening to the soft slap of water against the pilings. The wind tugged at my scarf. Somewhere deep in the wood, the old bolts groaned, as if they too understood the weight they held. Inside, I spread the lease and the operational transfer agreement, side by side on the desk. The contrast was almost laughable. One built to last, the other designed to strip without notice. Harold's Inc. versus a stranger's fine print. I took out a notepad and began a list. Not names, not accusations, just facts, dates, clauses, observations. Every line was a brick in a wall I intended to build between their plans and this place. The sun dropped behind the breakwater, casting long shadows through the parlor windows. I brewed a pot of peppermint tea, the steam fogging the glass for a moment before fading. Outside, the first evening star blinked over the bay. I didn't know exactly when they'd make their next move, but I knew they wouldn't see mine coming until it was already done. Quiet doesn't mean powerless. Sometimes, it's the only way to win. It started with the keys. One morning I found the spare set that usually hung by the kitchen door missing. The little brass ring with the chipped red boy charm Harold had added years ago, gone. In its place was a neat label in Brooke's handwriting. Master Set Brooke. The handwriting looped like it was trying to be friendly, but it wasn't. By the end of that week, Brooke had reorganized the pantry. The teas I'd blended, peppermint, lemon balm, chamomile, were shoved to the top shelf. On the counter sat a row of glass jars filled with trendy powders and imported matcha. Better for the camera, she'd said. I didn't argue. I simply moved my own tea tins to a cupboard in the reading room, behind the third row of novels. Then came the guest check-ins. I'd always greeted travelers with a pot of tea and a small plate of shortbread, listening to their stories before showing them to their rooms. Now, Brooke scheduled arrivals for times she knew I'd be in town. It's more efficient, she explained, her smile quick and practiced. Efficiency apparently meant guests no longer hurt the history of the lighthouse or the names of the fishermen who'd built the dock. Even the air felt different. The kitchen no longer smelled of baking bread. Instead, there was the faint chemical tang of whatever friendly cleaner Chase insisted on using for countertops before filming. The hum of the kettle in the mornings was replaced by the whir of a blender. I still had allies. Lydia, Margaret at the records office, a handful of regular guests who slipped me notes or jars of preserves with knowing looks. But the rhythm of the inn had shifted. I was no longer the keeper of the light. I was a tolerated relic, standing in the beam's shadow. One Saturday, I came downstairs to find the parlor filled with strangers. Lights and tripods crowded the space, and Brooke stood at the center, laughing into a camera. Chase stirred a pot at the fireplace, narrating about bringing modern coastal cuisine to a historic setting. I stayed at the edge of the room, leaning on the doorframe. The smell of saffron and butter drifted through the air. Beautiful, but foreign here. No one looked my way. My chair by the window, where I'd mended books for 20 years, had been pushed into a corner stacked with equipment cases. Later that evening, I carried my tea to the back steps. The tide was coming in, the water slapping against the pilings in a slow, relentless rhythm. Across the bay, the lights of the dock shimmered. That stretch of weathered wood still belonged to me. They couldn't cut it out of the frame unless they cut the frame itself. The moon rose silver over the water, casting a path straight to the ramp. I let the steam from my mug drift into the night and thought about Harold's words: keep the dock. Keep the spine. Everything else can be rebuilt, but not that. In the quiet, I realized they weren't just taking over rooms or rearranging shelves. They were trying to edit me out of the story. But you can't erase a keeper from her own lighthouse without the sea noticing. And the sea, it always takes its turn. The notice went up on the community board before I even heard about it. Harbor Light Open House, hosted by Brooke and Chase. Bold lettering, glossy photo of the lighthouse framed by a perfect summer sky. No mention of me. No mention of the years that had kept the place standing when storms took shingles and salt chewed the railings. I saw it while picking up bread from Miller's Bakery. The card was pinned just above the flyer for the annual blessing of the fleet, like it belonged there. Lydia spotted me staring. "You didn't know?" she asked quietly. I shook my head, tucking the loaf under my arm. The smell of warm rye made my stomach twist. First I'm hearing of it. That afternoon, the preparations began. Brooke's SUV came and went, unloading crates of wine glasses, floral arrangements in shades that didn't exist naturally in Rockport. Chase directed deliveries like a captain at sea, loud, authoritative, certain. I stayed in the kitchen, kneading dough for the bread I intended to keep for myself. The cinnamon sugar scent rose, grounding me. On the day of the event, I chose to be elsewhere. I walked the shoreline past the point, where the tide left ribbons of kelp and bits of shell. The wind off the water was brisk, carrying the faint strains of music from the lighthouse. It wasn't the fiddle and guitar we'd had at past gatherings. It was something canned, polished, meant to fill silence without conversation. By the time I returned, the crowd had thinned. Empty glasses and paper napkins littered the lawn. I slipped inside through the back door. The parlor smelled faintly of perfume and something fried. My chair by the window was still in the corner, but someone had draped a prop fishing net over it for atmosphere. In the kitchen, I found Margaret from the records office rinsing out a mug. "Couldn't stay away," she said with a wry smile. "Felt wrong without you here." I poured her some of the tea I'd kept steeping on the back burner, the peppermint sharp in the warm air. "Guess I wasn't on the guest list. Maybe not their list," she said, sipping. "But you're still on ours." We sat at the pine table, listening to the faint sound of waves against the dock. From here, you could see the ramp's silhouette through the window, a black line reaching into silver water. Margaret followed my gaze. "They can dress it up all they want, but the spine's still yours." When she left, I stayed by the table a long while. The lighthouse was quiet again, the way it used to be after a long night of storms, settled, but holding the memory of the wind. I walked to the back steps, mug in hand, and breathed in the briny air. They could host open houses, pose for photos, talk about their harbor light all they wanted. But the real harbor, the people, the history, the piece of this place that mattered, was still anchored where they couldn't reach. The moon was climbing higher, and the tide had turned, flooding back toward shore. I could feel it in my bones the same way I could feel that their season was just beginning. Mine, though, mine had never ended. The invitation arrived in the same gold foil envelopes Brooke favored. Harbor Light Gala celebrating our coastal heritage. The words were printed in looping script over a photograph of the lighthouse bathed in sunset light. Below, in smaller font, hosted by Brooke Hart and Chase Morrell. No mention of me, again. But this time, Lydia let slip that my name was on the volunteer list. Under hospitality support, the bay night glittered under a cold, clear sky. Strings of white lights traced the dock railings, their reflections trembling in the black water. I wore my best navy dress and Harold's old watch, its face scratched but steady. The lighthouse was warm and loud inside. Perfume chatter, the clink of glasses. Brooke spotted me near the door. "Perfect timing, Aunt Evelyn?" she said brightly, handing me a tray of champagne flutes. "We're short on servers." I felt the weight of the tray before I could answer, the chill of the glass stems biting into my palms. A few heads turned. Lydia's eyes narrowed from across the room, but she said nothing. I made my way through the crowd, offering glasses with a polite smile. Conversations dipped as I passed, then resumed in low hums. Chase, standing near the fireplace, was telling a group about his vision for revitalizing the lighthouse. "We want it to be more than a bed and breakfast," he said. "We want it to be a brand." One man asked about the dock, and I paused to hear his answer. "Oh, that's part of the package," Chase said smoothly. "We'll have full control soon." My grip tightened on the tray, but I kept moving. The scent of saffron and roasted garlic hung heavy in the air, mingling with the salt coming through the open balcony door. From outside, I could hear the water lapping against the pilings, steady as a heartbeat. Halfway through the evening, Brooke tapped a spoon against her glass. "Everyone, if I could have your attention." The room quieted. She beamed at the crowd. Tonight wouldn't be possible without the dedication of our incredible team. In particular, my dear Aunt Evelyn, who has been with Harbor Light for decades. Polite applause. Then she added, "And we're so grateful she's here tonight to help serve our guests as we step into this new chapter." It was said with the smoothness of a compliment, but the undertone was clear. She was the past holding a tray, while they were the future. A few people glanced between us, unsure how to react. I inclined my head, set the empty tray on a sideboard, and slipped out to the balcony. The cold air was sharp in my lungs. Below, the dock stretched into the dark, the lights from the railings fading to nothing at the end. My dock, still mine. Footsteps followed me, It was Margaret, her shawl pulled tight against the wind. She pressed a small envelope into my hand. "Thought you'd want this before they do," she murmured. Inside was a clipped notice from the town council, confirmation of an upcoming review for any commercial use of the dock. No approval without owner's signature, it read. I looked out at the water, the beam from the tower sweeping across the bay. The humiliation still burned, but now it had company. Quiet, solid, undeniable leverage. Margaret patted my arm. "Keep your spine, Evelyn. Let them think they've won the room. You've got the tide." I stayed on the balcony longer than I should have, letting the cold bite into my cheeks until they no longer burned from Brooke's words. The music inside swelled, a polished jazz trio, each note polished as smooth as the wine glasses I'd been carrying. When I finally stepped back into the parlor, the room had shifted. The guests were clustered around the fireplace, where Chase had set up a demonstration, something with lobster saffron and far too much flourish. Brooke saw me and waved me over. "Aunt Evelyn, would you mind bringing out the next course? It's the signature dish." Her voice was bright enough to carry across the room. A few guests chuckled as though it were all part of some quaint family act. I could feel the eyes on me, not in recognition, but in expectation. A retired innkeeper playing the part of kitchen help. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I walked past her into the kitchen. The scent hit me first. Rich, heavy, unfamiliar in the way that perfume from a stranger lingers too long. A stack of plates waited on the counter. Chase's assistant, a young man with hair perfectly slicked back, looked up. "These go to table," he said, jerking his chin toward the dining area as if I worked for him. I carried the plates out, one balanced on each arm. As I moved between the guests, I caught snippets of conversation. "They've done wonders with the place," one woman murmured. "Feels fresh." Another voice, softer, "I thought she owned it." "No one asked me." No one looked for an answer. Halfway through the room, a man in a tailored suit stepped in my path, holding out his empty glass. "Top this off, will you?" His tone was casual, the way you might speak to someone you'd never need to remember. I met his eyes, then glanced at the glass. "I'm sure Brooke can help you," I said, my voice even. I stepped around him without breaking stride. The plates landed on the table with quiet precision. I straightened, scanning the room. Lydia was near the door, arms crossed, watching the entire scene like a hawk. Her presence was a small anchor. Chase launched into a speech about the future of Harbor Light, gesturing toward Brooke. "With the right leadership, we can bring this historic property into the modern era," he said, smiling toward the crowd. Then, as if on cue, he gestured at me. "And of course, with the support of its legacy." Legacy. A word that fit neatly into a sentence while sliding the person it described into the past tense. The applause was warm, but it wasn't for me. I stood at the edge of the light, hands folded, the sound washing over me like waves against the rocks. Loud, but never reaching the heart of the stone. When the evening wound down, I slipped out before the last toast. The cold air outside was bracing. The dock lights glowed faintly against the dark water, the ramp catching the moonlight like a blade. I could hear the tide pushing in, each wave deliberate, inevitable. Margaret's envelope was still in my coat pocket, the council notice inside. I touched it through the fabric, feeling the crisp edge of the paper. It was proof that not all doors were closed, and that some were mine alone to open. Back in my kitchen, I lit a single lamp and made a cup of peppermint tea. The steam curled upward, smelling of earth and stubbornness. They could have their gala, their speeches, their applause. I had something they didn't even know they'd need, until the moment they couldn't move forward without it. And when that moment came, I'd be ready. If you were standing in my place that night, watching your own family erase you in front of a room full of strangers, would you fight back quietly, or walk away for good? The morning after the gala, the lighthouse felt unnaturally still. The scent of saffron still lingered faintly in the parlor, tangled with the faint tang of candle smoke. I opened the balcony door to let in the sea air, crisp and salted, until the space smelled like itself again. Margaret's envelope sat on the pine table, the council notice peeking out from its fold. I traced the printed words with my fingertip. No approval without owner's signature. Letting the phrase settle deep in my mind, I had leverage. But leverage without timing is just paper. By mid-morning, I decided to take a walk to town. The tide was low, the ramp slick with seaweed in patches. The gulls were noisy overhead, diving for scraps near the fish market. I kept my steps steady, rehearsing the casual tone I'd need for the questions I intended to ask. The The records office was quiet, only the hum of the old radiator for company. Margaret wasn't at the counter, but her deputy, a young man named Colby, looked up from a stack of folders. "Morning, Miss Hart." "Need the ledgers?" "Not today," I said, leaning on the counter. "I'm looking for any business filings under the name Morell, Chase Morell." His eyebrows lifted slightly, but he turned to the computer without a word. After a few keystrokes, he nodded toward the screen. "We've got two. One's an LLC registered to the restaurant in Portland. The other's a media company, co-owned with a Brooke Hart." My mouth went dry. "May I see the details?" He printed the basic info, registration dates, addresses, a few cryptic financial notations. The media company had been formed just 6 months ago. Its stated purpose: brand development and content production, hospitality sector. The address? The Lighthouse. I folded the paper and slipped it into my coat pocket. "Thank you, Colby." Leaving the records office, I crossed to the bank. The building's granite steps were worn smooth by a century of boots and salt air. Inside, it smelled faintly of paper and polished wood. My account manager, Helen, had known Harold and me since before the first shingles were replaced. She greeted me warmly. "Evelyn, what can I do for you?" I lowered my voice, purely hypothetical. If someone wanted to use the Lighthouse property as collateral for a loan, what would they need? Her smile faded slightly. "Your signature, and a clear title showing they had controlling interest." "And without either?" "They'd have to get creative," she said carefully, "or hope the bank didn't notice the gaps." As I left, I passed the corkboard near the entrance. Tacked there among charity events and lost pet notices was a flyer for a new Coastal Heritage Dining series, launching in the spring, produced by Moral Media, hosted at Harbor Light Inn, reservations opening soon. I stood staring at it until a customer brushed past. The flyer's photograph was telling. The lighthouse gleaming in evening light, but the dock cropped out entirely. Walking home, the wind had picked up, spitting cold spray from the bay. My coat collar was damp by the time I reached the ramp. The dock stood dark against the gray water, the pilings slick and strong. They'd cropped it from the photo because they couldn't control it. Not yet. Inside, I set the printed filings, the council notice, and the bank's quiet warning in a neat stack on my desk. 3 small stones. Together, they could start an avalanche if placed right. I brewed a pot of lemon balm tea, the scent bright and clean. Outside, the tide was coming in. The sound of it filled the room, a slow, steady promise that change moves in its own time, but it always moves. 2 days later, the phone rang just after sunrise. It was Lydia. "You up for a walk to the wharf?" "I've got something you'll want to hear." The morning was cold enough that the frost lingered on the grass, crunching under our boots as we headed toward the pier. Fishing boats rocked lazily in their slips, the air thick with diesel, brine, and the faint sweetness of bait crates. Lydia led me to a weathered shack where Jill, the supply man, was sorting boxes of kitchen staples, flour, sugar, sacks of rice. He squinted at me, then at Lydia. "You tell her, or should I?" "Tell me what?" I asked. He wiped his hands on his apron. "Your fancy chef, Morell. He's got invoices stacking up. Been ordering from me on 30-day terms, but it's been 60, 70. Now he's promising new funding come spring." I kept my voice even. "And Brooke, she's the one signing the orders now? Big shipments, expensive stuff. Not what you stock for a lighthouse B&B. This is high-end restaurant scale." The information sat heavy in my gut. "Any chance those bills touch my accounts?" Jill shook his head. "Not unless they wrangle access. But if they can convince investors the property's theirs." He let the thought hang in the cold air. Lydia glanced at me. "I figured you should know before it gets deeper." We walked back along the pier, the boards creaking underfoot. A gull wheeled overhead, crying once before vanishing toward open water. My hands stayed deep in my coat pockets, fingers brushing the folded filings from the records office. The picture was forming, too clearly now to ignore. Back at the lighthouse, I found Brooke in the parlor, surrounded by swatches of fabric and open laptops. "We're finalizing the look for the dining series," she said without looking up. "Chase wants something that photographs well for the website. Gil says you've been ordering supplies through him," I said lightly. Her head snapped up. "We have accounts all over town." "That's how you build relationships."
"That's one way."
I agreed. "Paying the invoices is another." A faint flush rose in her cheeks. "We're fine. You don't need to worry about it." She turned back to her laptop, ending the conversation with a finality that told me she was worried. whether she admitted it or not. Later that afternoon, I walked to the end of the dock. The tide was at its highest, the water surging under the ramp in deep, rhythmic swells. The wind brought the smell of kelp and cold iron. Standing there, I imagined the dock as more than a piece of property. It was the gate they couldn't pass without me opening it. On the way back inside, I spotted an envelope tucked into the storm door. No return address, just my name in a handwriting I didn't recognize. Inside was a single page, a copy of a preliminary investor prospectus for Moral Media's Coastal Heritage Dining Series, projected revenue, sponsorship tiers, and a note in the margin beside the venue description. Dock access pending. Pending. They'd built their pitch on something they didn't yet own, like a ship built around a hole in the hull. I folded the paper carefully and added it to the growing stack on my desk: council notice, business filings, bank advisement, supplier warning, now the investor sheet, each one a piece of the same puzzle, all pointing to the same conclusion. Without my signature, their empire was a sandcastle at low tide. The sun was setting when I made tea, the beam from the lighthouse sweeping across the water in slow, steady arcs. Outside, the bay was turning gold, then deepening to indigo. Inside, my resolve was settling just as firm. They thought they were tightening a net. They didn't realize I was the tide. I couldn't sleep. The lighthouse was quiet, the kind of deep, winter quiet that makes the walls seem to hold their breath. Outside, the wind rattled the panes now and then, but the steady rotation of the beacon kept slicing through the dark, sweeping across the room in gentle arcs. I sat at the kitchen table with a mug of chamomile, the steam curling into the cold air. The stack of papers lay in front of me, the filings, the council notice, the investor sheet, Jill's invoice records. They looked harmless in the lamplight, just ink and paper. But together they were the spine of something solid. I could hear Harold's voice in my head. Never pick a fight in a storm. Wait for the tide to turn. Then you move. He'd said it the year the nor'easter took half the shingles off the roof. And we'd patched it piece by piece rather than call in a company that would gut the place. Tonight, it wasn't the shingles at stake. It was the whole frame. I spread the papers out like a map. The dock lease was my anchor. Without it, their dining series couldn't operate as pitched. The council's approval process was slow, deliberate. Investors hated delays. I could make those delays stretch just long enough for their bills to pile higher than the water at high tide. But it wasn't enough to block them. I needed to strengthen my own ground. At 2 a.m, I pulled out an old spiral notebook from the drawer. Harbor light maintenance logs turned strategy ledger. I listed names. Lydia, Margaret, Jill, Helen at the bank. People who knew the truth about ownership. People who had quietly chosen my side without asking for credit. They were more than friends. They were witnesses. The tea had gone lukewarm, but I kept writing. Under each name, I noted what they could confirm, what records they held, and how quickly they could be reached. Then I added a second list: every permit license and contract tied to the lighthouse. I would review each one for loopholes before the week was out. Around 3, I stood and crossed to the balcony. The air was sharp enough to sting my lungs, but it cleared my mind. Below, the dock was a dark silhouette against the glinting water. I imagined Brooke and Chase trying to explain to their investors why the most photogenic piece of the property was locked behind paperwork they couldn't touch. The thought didn't bring joy, not exactly, but it steadied me. Power, I was realizing, wasn't always in what you owned outright. Sometimes it was in what you could withhold. When I finally returned to the kitchen, I packed the documents into Harold's old leather briefcase, the one with the worn handle and salt-stiff seams. It felt good in my hand. Weighty, purposeful. The horizon was paling when I finally let myself rest, stretching out on the couch under a heavy wool blanket. My mind was still turning, but the knots in my chest had loosened. The plan wasn't finished, but it had a spine. And like Harold used to say, if you keep your spine, you can weather the sea. As I drifted off, the sound of the tide was the last thing I heard, relentless, sure, and very much on my side. By sunrise, the wind had shifted, carrying the faint smell of thawing kelp and wood smoke from the village. I dressed in layers, wool sweater, Harold's old pea coat, and slipped the leather briefcase under my arm. First stop was the records office. Margaret was just unlocking the door, her breath visible in the cold. "You're early," she said, pulling off her gloves. "Couldn't sleep," I replied. "I need certified copies of every lease, permit, and historical designation tied to Harbor Light, and I want them in both digital and paper form." Her eyebrows rose, but she didn't ask why. Give me an hour. From there, I headed to the bank. Helen looked up from her desk with that same quiet concern I'd seen after Harold died. Morning, Evelyn. I need a written statement of account ownership for the property, something official, stamped and signed. And while we're at it, let's review any liens or collateral requests made in the past year. Her pen stilled midair. Something's happening. I smiled faintly. Let's just say I prefer to be prepared. An hour later, I walked out with a sealed envelope under my arm, the bank's embossed crest pressed into the flap. In the briefcase, Margaret's documents sat neatly clipped, ready to be filed in 3 different safe places before the day was done. At the wharf, Gil was unloading sacks of flour from his truck. Morning, Jill, I called. He straightened, wiping his hands. You here to talk invoices? Not yet, I said, but keep copies of every order they place, dates, amounts, the whole thing. If anyone asks why, tell them it's standard procedure for accounts over 90 days. His grin was quick, sharp. Got it. By mid-morning, I was back at the lighthouse. Brooke's SUV was gone, which suited me. I climbed the narrow stairs to the tower, the metal cold under my palm. From the top, the view stretched clear to the horizon, Bay Harbor, and the thin thread of the dock cutting into the water. Standing there, I thought of Harold again. How he used to say a good mariner never fought the tide, only worked with it. I could feel the tide turning now, not in one sudden rush, but in a series of small, deliberate shifts. Paperwork filed, allies queued, records secured, each move invisible until the moment it mattered. Back downstairs, I locked the briefcase in the cedar chest in my bedroom. The scent of the wood rose up, warm, faintly sweet. That chest had held our wedding album for decades. Now it held something less sentimental, but just as precious. Before noon, I called Lydia. If you hear of any investors sniffing around, let me know. You think they'll make a push soon? I think they already have, I said. They just don't know they're pushing against a wall. She laughed softly. That's the Evelyn I know. The rest of the day I went about the routine, laundry, baking, answering guest inquiries, as though nothing had changed. But under the surface, everything had shifted. Every folded towel, every loaf cooling on the rack, felt like a quiet refusal to be moved. By evening, the lighthouse smelled of fresh bread and lemon polish. The beam swept the dark water with steady precision. Somewhere across town, Brooke and Chase were likely pitching their vision, unaware that the foundation under them was already eroding, and I was finally ready to let the tide do its work. The first move was easy, because it looked like nothing at all. On Monday morning, I baked 2 loaves of honey oat bread and wrapped them in wax paper. One went to the town clerk's office, the other to the council chair, Alma Prescott. Alma had a sweet tooth and a long memory. Over tea in her office, I mentioned the council's upcoming review for dock access. Just making sure I'm on the notification list when anything changes, I said, slicing the bread for her. Her eyes twinkled. You'll know before anyone else, Evelyn? Step 1. Anchored. The next day, I stopped by the harbor master's shed. The place smelled of rope, salt, and diesel. Jim Porter was bent over a chart, pencil in hand. Morning, Jim. I need the latest maintenance report for the dock, full inspection notes. He handed over a clipboard without question. Everything's up to code. You keeping it private use still? For now? I said, tucking the papers into my bag, just staying on top of things. Each document was another stone in the wall I was building, quiet, steady, invisible from the outside. By midweek, I turned to the guest register. A few regulars were due in the spring, the kind who loved the lighthouse for its peace, not its Instagram potential. I wrote each of them a personal note, confirming their bookings and adding a line, Harbor Light Inn remains privately operated. Your privacy and comfort are assured. It was both reassurance and a subtle reminder to the town that the place was still mine. On Thursday, I saw Brooke and Chase across the street outside the print shop. They were reviewing proofs for a glossy brochure, the lighthouse shining on the cover. I stayed on my side of the street, slipping into the hardware store to buy a new lock for the dock gate. No need to make a show of it. I'd install it quietly at dusk. Back at the lighthouse, I brewed a pot of peppermint tea and set the stack of gathered documents on the kitchen table: council notice, dock inspection, business filings, bank statement. Together, they formed the skeleton of a defense chase, and Brooke couldn't see coming. That night I walked to the dock with the new lock in my coat pocket. The air was sharp, the tide high, the moon glinting off the water in broken silver. I fastened the lock on the gate, the click loud in the stillness. To anyone else, it was just a bit of security. To me, it was a signal. One more inch of ground they couldn't take. By Friday, the Whisper Network had started. Lydia told me she'd overheard two of the council members speculating about changes to the dock's status. I neither confirmed nor denied. Let them wonder. In the quiet moments, I felt a small, steady satisfaction. Not triumph, this wasn't over, but a kind of balance returning. They were still moving pieces on their side of the board, but they didn't realize I was rearranging the rules. Late that evening, I sat on the balcony with a blanket over my knees, watching the beams sweep across the bay. The tide was turning, slowly but surely, and I was the one keeping the light on. Saturday morning, I took the long way to the farmer's market. The wind carried the scent of wood smoke and cinnamon from the bakery stalls, and I let myself linger by the apples, chatting with neighbors about the early frost. It was important to keep my routine visible. Let everyone see me as steady, unchanged. People talk less when they believe you're predictable. Near the end of the row, I spotted Tom Keating from the Rockport Gazette, notebook in his back pocket. "Evelyn," he said, "I hear Harbor Light might be hosting some kind of big dining event." I smiled and tilted my head. "Might be news to me, Tom. All I know is Harbor Light stays open to the public on my terms, and those terms haven't changed." He jotted something down. I didn't have to tell him more. He'd do the rest. Tom had a way of planting ideas in print that lingered in the minds of readers, especially the kind who also happened to sit on investor boards. From the market, I walked to Helen's office at the bank. She handed me an envelope before I even sat down. "You'll want to see this?" Inside was a memo forwarded from an investor group in Portland. It confirmed what I'd suspected. They were considering funding Chase's Coastal Heritage Dining Series, but had flagged pending property access issues as a concern. My lips pressed into a thin line. That single phrase could freeze a deal faster than winter ice on the dock. "Do they know the access is controlled?" I asked. Helen's eyes softened. "They do now." By midday, I was back at the lighthouse, reviewing my notes. Brooke and Chase were counting on momentum. Press releases, flashy brochures, investor pitches. To push their project through before anyone could question the details. My plan was simple: slow the current until they were stuck in still water. That afternoon, I stopped by the cooperative cafe, Tea and Tides, run by the fishing family's wives. I donated 3 of my best herbal blends to their spring fundraiser, making sure the event flyer clearly stated, "From the private collection of Harbor Light Inn." The words were a quiet reminder. Ownership wasn't just legal, it was woven into the fabric of the community. As dusk fell, I received a text from Lydia. "Heard Chase's investor dinner is postponed." No explanation. I tucked the phone away, not letting the smile reach my face until I was alone in the kitchen. I brewed a pot of mint and lemon balm, letting the steam fog the window. Outside, the dock lights glimmered on the water, steady and untouchable. Every move I'd made this week, documents filed, conversations seated, locks changed, reminders placed, wasn't about confrontation. It was about reminding them, and everyone watching, that I was the constant they couldn't bypass. They thought they were building a stage. They didn't realize I'd been quietly dismantling the foundation. Later, as the beam swept the horizon, I leaned back in my chair and thought about the question I'd ask if this were someone else's story. If you were in my place, watching your family gamble with something you built, and knowing one quiet decision could stop them, would you make your move now or wait until the tide was highest? It began with a phone call I wasn't supposed to hear. I'd left the parlor window cracked for the sea breeze, and the wind carried Brooke's voice from the driveway. "They've pulled out, Chase. Every one of them. The investors say they won't commit until we have full property access." Chase's reply was sharp, almost desperate. "Then get it. She's family. She can't hold this forever." I leaned against the cool window frame, letting the words sink in. The tide was high outside, the waves slapping the pilings in short, impatient bursts. It felt like the water itself was echoing my heartbeat. By noon, they were gone in the SUV, headed, no doubt, for another meeting to salvage what they could. I used the quiet to take my final step. From the cedar chest, I lifted Harold's leather briefcase and placed it on the kitchen table. Inside, every document I'd gathered was neatly filed. The dock lease, the certified ownership papers, the inspection reports, the investor memo, the council notices. Each page stamped, signed, irrefutable. I added one more, a fresh letter drafted that morning, formally rescinding permission for any commercial events on the property without written consent from me. 3 copies, one for the council, one for the bank, one for the harbor master. By mid-afternoon, I was walking into the council chambers, the scent of lemon polish and old paper heavy in the air. Alma Prescott looked up from her desk. "Evelyn, this about the dining series? This is about the lighthouse?" I said, placing the envelope in front of her. "As of today, no commercial activity can proceed without my express written approval." She scanned the page, then nodded slowly. "This will stop them cold. That's the point." From there, I delivered the other copies. The harbor master, Jim, slipped his into a locked drawer. "No one gets through that gate without your say-so," he said. "Matter of fact." At the bank, Helen slid hers into a folder marked Property Hart. The air felt different as I walked back along Main Street, the late light catching on shop windows and the masts in the harbor. Every move I'd made until now had been about building the wall. This one was about closing the gate. When I reached the lighthouse, the beam had just begun its evening sweep. The tide was already pulling out, the dock standing clear against the wet sand. I stood there for a long moment, the key to the new lock cool in my pocket. Somewhere down the road, Brooke and Chase were about to discover that every door they'd planned to walk through was now closed, and I was the one holding the keys. They came back just before sunset. I was in the kitchen, slicing bread, when the crunch of tires on gravel broke the quiet. The back door swung open without a knock. Brooke's voice already sharp. "What did you do?" she demanded, the words hitting the air like stones. I set the knife down, wiped my hands, and turned. "Good evening to you two." Chase stepped in behind her, face tight. "We just found out the council revoked our event permits. Investors are walking. You think this is a win?" I met his stare. "It's not about winning. It's about what belongs to me staying mine." Brooke's arms crossed over her chest. "You're punishing us over a dock. We could have made this work for everyone." I took a step closer, voice even. "You built your plans on property you don't own without asking. That's not a partnership. That's a takeover." Chase exhaled sharply, pacing. "Do you have any idea what you've cost us?" "Less," I said. "Exactly what you were about to cost me." For a moment, the only sound was the ticking of the old clock in the hallway. Brooke's gaze dropped to the table, to the neatly stacked envelopes there. She reached for one. "Go ahead," I told her. "Read it. That's the council's certified notice. No commercial use without my consent. Signed, sealed, and filed." She skimmed the first few lines, then set it down like it burned. "So that's it. You'd rather kill our future than share what you've got?" I shook my head. "This isn't about sharing. This is about respect. And you haven't shown any." Chase's jaw tightened, but he didn't speak. Brooke glanced at him, then back at me. "You always made it sound like the lighthouse was for the family." "Guess I was wrong." "You're right about one thing," I said quietly. "It's for the family, the ones who remember what family means." Silence settled again, heavier this time. They both knew the fight was over, even if they didn't want to admit it. Without the dock, without the permits, their glossy brochures were nothing but paper. Finally, Chase muttered something under his breath and walked out. Brooke lingered a second longer, as if searching my face for a crack, then followed him. The sound of the SUV starting, the crunch of tires fading down the road, it all felt like a door closing for good. I stood at the window until the taillights vanished, the lighthouse beams sweeping over the dark water in measured arcs. They'd thought they could force my hand. Instead, they'd learned I still knew how to keep it steady. The council chamber was packed. Word had spread fast, and by the time I took my seat near the front, every chair was filled. Fishermen in salt-stained caps, shop owners in their aprons, a few curious tourists, all waiting for the dock use, agenda item that had somehow become the talk of Rockport. Alma Prescott gaveled the meeting to order. Item 12, review of harbor light dock access and related commercial permits. I stood briefcase in hand and walked to the table. The beam of the overhead lights was warm on my shoulders, but my voice stayed steady. "For generations," I began, "the harbor light dock has served this community. It is private property, maintained at private expense. I have always opened it for emergencies, for neighbors, for events that serve the town. But no one, not even family, has the right to claim it for their own profit without my consent." I opened the briefcase and laid out the documents, the certified lease, inspection reports, ownership papers. Each page carried the town seal, each one indisputable. Murmurs rippled through the room. From the corner of my eye, I saw Brooke and Chase sitting in the back, His face was set like stone, hers was pale. Alma nodded toward the council members, all in favor of affirming Harbor Lights dock as private use unless expressly authorized by the owner. Hands went up. Every one of them. The vote was unanimous. The gavel fell. Motion carried. It was done. I gathered the papers slowly, sliding them back into Harold's briefcase. When I turned, Brooke's eyes met mine. She didn't speak, but I saw the understanding there, the moment when denial gives way to the weight of reality. The crowd began to disperse. People stopped to pat my shoulder, to murmur congratulations. "You did right," Jill said, giving my arm a squeeze. They never should have tried it. They out on the front steps, the cool evening air hit my face like a clean wave. The sun was dropping toward the horizon, painting the water in streaks of gold and rose. I could see the lighthouse from here, standing solid against the wind, its beam just beginning its first sweep of the night. Brooke stepped out behind me. For a moment, I thought she might speak. Instead, she just stood there, looking out at the bay. Her hands were empty, no papers, no phone. After a long silence, she walked away without a word. I stood alone on the steps, the sounds of the town settling around me, the creak of a shop sign in the breeze, the distant hum of a boat engine, the rhythmic lap of water against the pilings. This was never about crushing them. It was about holding the line, the way Harold taught me, to stand firm, quiet, until the tide shifts in your favor. And tonight, the tide was all mine. The morning after the council vote, Rockport felt quieter. It wasn't just the weather, though the sky was a flat, pale gray and the sea barely stirred. It was in the way people greeted me, smaller smiles, softer nods, like the town itself had exhaled. The storm had passed, and now came the still water. I started my day the same way I always did, unlocking the lighthouse door, breathing in that faint mix of salt, wood, and lemon oil. The beam had gone dark with dawn, but the place still felt alive. I put on a pot of coffee and sliced bread for breakfast guests, moving through the kitchen with the ease of a routine I'd fought hard to protect. Word about Brooke and Chase was already circulating. Lydia told me over tea that they'd canceled their last few meetings and stopped showing up at the market. Some folks speculated they'd go back to Portland. Others thought they'd stick it out but keep their heads down. I didn't weigh in. My focus was here, on the inn, on the guests reading in the parlor, on the scent of muffins baking in the oven. The air felt easier to breathe now that I wasn't guarding every conversation, every movement. By late morning, I walked down to the dock. The lock clicked open under my hand, the chain swinging loose. The boards were damp from the tide, gulls wheeling overhead. I stood at the edge and let the water's rhythm steady my thoughts. It struck me how different this quiet felt compared to the silence I'd endured weeks ago, when Brooke's words at the engagement party had landed like a slap. Back then, quiet had felt like exile. Now it felt like peace. On the walk back, I stopped by Tea and Tides. Margaret was at the counter, packing orders. "You know," she said, "since you donated those blends, we've had twice as many visitors. People want to support what you're doing." "That's good news," I said, meaning it. Community, when nurtured, had a way of returning the care. That afternoon, I took out the spiral notebook I'd used during those sleepless nights. The lists of names, permits, and strategies were still there, but I flipped to a clean page. This one would be for plans of a different kind. Maintenance projects for spring, a new reading nook for the parlor, maybe even a small writing workshop for locals. I wasn't narvy enough to think challenges wouldn't come again, but now I knew my own steadiness could hold, even when the people closest to me tried to shake it. Near sunset, I lit the lantern room. The beam swept out over the bay, the same as it had every night, but now it felt like a reminder rather than a duty. Some things are worth keeping exactly as they are, and I had kept them. The second morning after the vote, the fog rolled in early. It blurred the shoreline, softened the outlines of the fishing boats, and wrapped the lighthouse in a damp hush. I was halfway through sweeping the front steps when I heard the crunch of footsteps on the gravel. Brooke stood at the gate, hands in the pockets of her windbreaker. She didn't move forward until I set the broom aside. "I didn't know if you'd want to see me," she said. "That's your choice," I replied. My voice was calm, even, the way it had been in council chambers. She looked down at the damp boards of the path. "We left town for a couple of days. Chase says there's nothing here for us now." I didn't answer. Some silences are better left unfilled. After a moment, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I found this in one of the old guest journals. It's from when I stayed here the summer I turned 12. She held it out. I opened it. In uneven handwriting, a much younger Brooke had written, "I love the lighthouse. I want to live here when I'm big so I can make tea and watch the light with Aunt Evelyn forever." The paper trembled slightly in my hands, but not from the wind. I folded it again, slowly. "You did love it once?" I said. Her eyes met mine then. Tired, but without the sharpness I'd seen for months. "I forgot why." I didn't tell her that forgetting had been the heart of the problem. I didn't tell her that love without respect turns to entitlement before you even notice. I just nodded and slipped the paper into my sweater pocket. She shifted her weight, glancing toward the dock. If I come back? Maybe just for tea sometime." "Well, see," I said. It was the only answer I could give and still mean it. Brooke nodded once as if she'd expected that, then turned toward the road. The fog swallowed her figure within a few steps, leaving the sound of her retreating footsteps and the soft hiss of the tide. I stood there for a long time after she'd gone, the paper warm against my side. Maybe this was as close to an apology as she could manage right now. Maybe it would take months, years, or never. I didn't need to know yet. Inside, the lighthouse felt the same as it had yesterday. Polished wood, faint lemon oil, the steady tick of the clock in the hall. I poured a mug of tea and took it to the lantern room. From up there, the fog was a living thing, curling around the beam, diffusing it into a gentle glow. It reminded me that light isn't always about sharpness. Sometimes it's about warmth that reaches you even when you can't see where it's coming from. And for now, that was enough. Spring arrived in Rockport with a slow, generous thaw. The ice broke in the harbor first, drifting out to sea in quiet sheets. Then came the gulls, the early tourists, the smell of salt mixed with fresh paint as shopkeepers opened their doors again. At Harbor Light, I repainted the balcony rail myself, the brush stroke steady, the white wood gleaming against the blue. The guest rooms filled quickly that season. Old friends returned, some bringing new faces who'd heard about the little lighthouse inn where time slows down. In the parlor, laughter replaced the brittle quiet of winter. People lingered over tea, swapping stories as the afternoon light moved across the walls. Tea and tides thrived too. Margaret and the co-op had expanded the menu, pairing my herbal blends with fresh pastries. The proceeds funded 2 new scholarships for the children of fishing families. Seeing their names posted on the community board felt better than any business award I'd ever received. Every week, I walked the dock with the same key in my pocket. Sometimes I unlocked the gate for a wedding photographer or a marine biologist with samples to take. Always with permission, always with clear terms. The boundaries I'd set held firm, and instead of feeling like walls, they felt like the frame of a home. On Sundays, I hosted a small reading hour in the lantern room. Locals brought whatever they were working on. Poems, essays, memoirs. The beam swept overhead while we shared words that mattered, the kind that hold weight because they're earned. I saw in their faces the same quiet satisfaction I felt knowing you belong exactly where you are. Once in a while, I thought about Brooke. We hadn't had a long talk since that morning in the fog, but she'd sent a card at Easter. Just 3 words in her handwriting, "Still love tea." It was enough to leave the door open, even if just a crack. One evening, standing at the balcony, I watched the sun sink into the horizon, the sky burning with color. The beam from the lantern room cut through the dusk, just as it always had, and for the first time in a long while, I realized I wasn't holding it all up out of duty or defense. I was holding it up because I wanted to, because this light, this place, this life, wasn't just my past. It was my legacy. By midsummer, the lighthouse was more than full. It was alive. Children chased each other along the garden paths while their parents read on the porch. The smell of lemon balm and fresh scones drifted from the kitchen. Every sound, every scent felt rooted, as if the place itself was breathing again. One morning, I opened Harold's old cedar chest and found the brass telescope he'd used on calm nights. It had been wrapped in a wool scarf, the glass still clear. I carried it up to the lantern room and set it on the wide sill. It belonged there, not locked away in a chest, but looking outward, ready to frame whatever came next. That week, I invited the Tea and Tides board to the lighthouse for an evening meeting. We sat in the parlor, the windows open to the summer breeze, discussing plans for a Harbor Light Scholarship Fund, in Harold's name. The idea was simple, a permanent fund to support local kids who wanted to study marine science, hospitality, or the arts. The smiles around the table told me it was the right step. Later that night, After everyone had gone, I took the telescope in hand and walked out to the dock. The tide was high, the moon low and gold on the water. I lifted the glass to my eye and scanned the horizon, the beam from the lantern room sweeping over the dark. Somewhere out there were ships I'd never see, stories I'd never hear. But the light would still reach them. I thought of Brooke again. Not with anger, not even with hurt. Just with the knowledge that some relationships mend slowly, like wood absorbing oil after years of weather. You tend them, but you don't rush them. A sudden gust lifted my hair, and I laughed softly into the wind. I remembered Harold's voice telling me, on our very first night here, a lighthouse keeper's real job isn't just to guard against wrecks. It's to make sure the light never forgets how to shine. That's what I'd done. Through betrayal, through silence, through the tug of the tide, I'd kept the light steady. As I locked the dock gate for the night, I looked back once more at the beam stretching over the bay. It didn't ask for applause. It didn't demand notice. It simply did its work, the way it had for more than a century. And so would I. This place, this light, wasn't just a marker on the map. It was proof that boundaries can stand, that dignity can be defended without shouting, that legacy is built one quiet choice at a time. When I turned toward the house, the lantern's glow fell across the path, leading me forward. It was time to rest, knowing the light would keep watch. In the end, keeping the lighthouse wasn't about winning against Brooke or stopping Chase's plans. It was about remembering that what you've built, your work, your values, your peace, deserves the same care you'd give to a child or a home. People will test those boundaries, sometimes in the name of family, sometimes in the name of opportunity. And when they do, you don't have to fight with noise or anger. You can stand steady, quietly, until the tide shifts in your favor. My lesson was simple. You can protect what's yours without losing yourself in the battle. Legacy isn't just what you leave behind. It's the way you live in the present, showing others that dignity can be held with open hands. In a world that moves fast and takes more than it gives, the strongest stand isn't always loud. Sometimes the strongest stand is a light that keeps shining, steady, unshaken through every storm.